Good morning. We're coming to you a day early this morning. We have some homework for you. Joshua chapter number 24 is the chapter I'd like to encourage you to read. God tells his people Israel about all that he has for them in the land into which he is bringing them. He had plenty for them. He had barns that they didn't fill. He had cities that they didn't build. He had a land that flowed with milk and honey for his people. But in this land, they were completely boxed in. When God brought them to this land, it was called the Promised Land for a reason. They had to trust his promise. When we look at the landscape, the geography of Israel, we see that it was a land, yes, a land that God brought them to, but it was a land that demanded for them to live by faith. We think about the geography. There were swamps from Lake Hula to the north of Israel, and then beyond those swamps, if they could get through those swamps, was the Assyrian army. To their east was a desert, a vast desert, and past that were more enemies with which they would have to contend. To the south, they had the Philistines and the land of the Philistines, and then they had Egypt beyond the Philistines, the land that God had brought them out of. And so they were completely boxed in. And then to the west, they had a shore, but it was a concordant shoreline. You say, well, Brother Hauser, what is that? It was a shoreline that the way the water came in, the way the tide came in, it laid silt on the shore. And you say, well, why is that important? Well, they couldn't have a harbor. There was no way for them to have a harbor because of that concordant shoreline. So they couldn't build any vessels to go to a different land to flee from the land that God had placed them in. They were entirely dependent on trusting God in the place that he brought them. And to top it all off, the land of Israel in which he placed them was entirely dependent. All of the crops, all of the animals were entirely dependent on God sending the former and the latter rains. You say, well, why is that important? Well, because God controls the spigot in heaven, right? And so if he withholds the rain, there would be famine. People would die. You see, God brought them to a place that was the promised land. But the difference between their lack and their plenty was God's providence, God's divine provision for them. You see, God had something great for his people, but he put them in a place where their life was predicated on his providence and his provision for them. He had them in a place where they had to stay close to him and live by faith. It reminds me of this verse in Psalm 55 that God used King David to pen, and it says this, "And I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then would I fly away and be at rest. Lo, then would I wander off and remain in the wilderness, Selah." You see, King David here was saying there were times that he wished in the difficulty that he had wings, that he could just fly away and be out of the storm. But he realized that if he was able to do that, he would wander off. He realized that it was his need, it was his difficulty, it was the trial in his life that kept him close and dependent on God. May I say to you today, God does the same thing for you and us. He does the same thing for each of us. I could take you to many times in my life where my only hope was God's divine intervention. And may I say, those aren't always our favorite spots in which to be, but they are always the most needful. I think back many years ago to 9/11. I was in third grade. I remember that day. I remember the next Sunday in church, there was not a seat anywhere in the house. A tragic event that took place, and it did not change the people. All it did was it helped them to realize their need. People turned to God. People got involved in church. People surrendered their life to God. You say, why? Because of the place in which he had put them. They realized that their life was predicated on God's divine providence. May I say this? We do not wish for times like that. But times like that show us our need for Him. And I'd like to say to you today, your life, whether you realize it or not, is predicated on His providence. Your family is entirely dependent on God doing what He does. Your marriage, your health. We get so boastful, so prideful with our successes, and I'm the one that did it for me. And who gave you the health to do it? Your success is predicated on God. Truthfully, your joy is predicated on God. So might I encourage you that you not try to find a way out of the situation in which God has placed you, should you be going through a trial, but rather trust Him to do what He said He would do and seek to live a life that would please Him. Hudson Taylor, a great missionary hero of yesteryear, made this statement: God has something better for you, far better for you than gold and riches. And that is helpless dependence upon Him. May I say today, you and I are dependent upon Him. Might I encourage you that you depend on Him, you follow Him, and you serve Him today, because your plenty, your provision is predicated on His providence. We love you, folks. We'll see you tomorrow night at 7 for our miracle service. Have a great day.